Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Asian Matters, Standing with Rochester's Asian American Communities, a three-part series developed by the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester in partnership with Monroe Community College's Department of Global Education and International Services. We began planning this program several weeks ago amid reports of increasing attacks on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders around the country that have numbered nearly 4,000 since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Never could we have imagined the horrific slayings that would take place in Atlanta last Tuesday. Our mission at the Levine Center to End Hate is to unite the Greater Rochester community in overcoming hate through education, dialogue, and positive action. We are so glad you've joined us today. And now let me introduce the moderator for today's program, Christina Lee. Christina is a member of the Levine Center Steering Committee and coordinator of global education at Monroe Community College. Christina?
Thank you, Karen. I was muted. We are glad to partner today for this important discussion and call to action. We will start today's event with presentations from our two panelists. The question and answer function is available to you as they present, so please type your questions there and we will do our best to address as many as we can in this hour. I'd like to introduce our two panelists today. Dr. Natasha Chen Christensen is an associate professor of sociology at Monroe Community College in the Department of Anthropology, History, Political Science, and Sociology. Her specialties include intersectionality, critical race theory, gender, social stratification, and sexuality. Dr. Pilapa Esara Carroll is a cultural anthropologist who teaches about issues of migration and gender. She is an associate professor in the anthropology department at SUNY Brockport. Her current research project examines the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic upon local refugee communities. So today we'll start with Dr. Christensen.
Thank you, Christina. And so like Christina said, we started planning this before the events of Tuesday. I had actually planned an entire presentation, but I would like to address the events of Tuesday, especially the mainstream narrative that has surrounded it. And I think the most dangerous element of this mainstream narrative is this idea that this was not about race. Over and over, I've actually heard people assert that it's not about race, that they've centralized the murderer, right, and kind of talked about him having a bad day, about him being at the end of the rope, focusing then, right, on the white male murderer. What did he say was his intention? He was removing temptation, right? He had a sexual addiction. He was removing temptation. Now, already with that, you're already seeing this idea of not making these women human, right? Because usually when you talk about removing temptation, you're talking about inanimate objects. I hear it most often about the kitchen, right? People taking the donuts out of their kitchen, not humans. So what happens here is you're looking at an intersection, not just of race. It's not just racial identity in this case, it is also gender. And these two combine together to create a unique situation for Asian American women. So essentially we've been stereotyped into this one form of woman, and this woman is docile, she's subservient, she's passive, and at the very same time she's hypersexual, and all of this is kind of colored with the idea of being exotic, right? Kind of this new kind of version of a woman. Now, it is a very common stereotype, and what it is actually is really created through fantasy. That is, if you look at the East Asian countries in which, you know, most of the women who are stereotyped like this are from, you are looking at very conservative sexual norms, like very, very conservative sexual norms. So where did this come from? overall, we actually look at America's involvement in different wars and the American GIs visiting these countries. The only women that they actually interacted with at the time were sex workers, right? And so there was this association then of availability of sex then with these women that they were meeting in these countries. Now, what happens in this case though, is it's not attraction. It's not just attraction or physical desire, because in one way you're desirable, but the other thing that's conveyed to you is that you're an object, you're a temptation, right? Asian American women actually have this issue of being treated as one member of this undifferentiated mass of Asian American women. Instead of me being Natasha, then it would just be, oh, well, you're an Asian woman, right? What I found is that mainstream media took this narrative up very, very readily. And I actually saw people that very day arguing on the murderer's behalf. And I really do think that you should really examine then what was the tendency that actually made American society grab onto this notion of his sexual addiction as being a legitimate reason to murder 8 people. These women ranged in age from 44 to 74. In fact, half of them were in their 60s and 70s. So once again, this idea of temptation does not seem like a very valid one. These women were targeted not because of their individual actions, not because of their life experience, not because of who they were, but because they were members of a category that one man found dangerous to himself, and it made more sense for him to take out than the danger. And I will say that I actually navigate the world with relative ease due to stereotypes of Asian American women. We're generally not considered dangerous category of people. And in fact, you would probably say with this stereotype of Asian women as being submissive and docile, that we are generally not seen as threats. Well, in 2020, I was labeled a dangerous threat, not just once, but twice by the American federal government, okay? And so most of you guys know that around the beginning of 2020, that the narrative then around COVID-19 actually centered then around the concept of China and East Asia. It then becoming a very clear target in terms of the people then who were blamed for this issue. So there was that piece of it. And then later in the fall, I was called a danger again. And that is because of the subject that I've studied for most of my life, and that is critical race theory. At the time, I heard politicians, I heard Fox News newscasters, I heard a lot of people talking about critical race theory. It was demonized as unpatriotic, as being divisive, as being untrue, and as being completely radical. And pretty much I heard everything said about critical race theory except for an explanation of what critical race theory is. It actually got to the level that my mom sent me a sermon from their church's pastor, and it was about critical race theory and how it was illegitimate and how it was absolutely dangerous to American society. And I actually sat down and thought and decided none of these people could actually explain what critical race theory was, only that it was dangerous. Critical race theory is actually a very, very simple premise, basically saying that if America's success is solely dependent on the capital, the money that was raised through the brutal enslavement of Black Americans who were kidnapped and exploited as a free pool of labor, then fundamentally, the US is founded on racism, right? It sounds very harsh. But if you think about how that operates, then you can say you cannot talk about American history, you cannot talk about American society without talking about race. To do so, then you are missing a huge, huge factor in the development and founding of this nation. So what do I mean by this? Well, we actually look at the structural causes to all of this, and we look at the laws and policies that were put into place then to regulate all of this. Now, before 2001, our immigration was controlled by the US Department of Labor, right? And so once again, I talked about this idea of exploiting labor. Immigration was controlled by the Department of Labor simply because America then has actually used the labor of different groups then to build itself and to strengthen itself, okay? And so I am actually going to use Asian Americans as an example of critical race theory, and to illustrate my point that we can actually look at this idea of the policies and the laws that America put on Asian Americans to lead to this idea of us feeling kind of perpetually, excluded from American society. So we actually even start out with the term Asian American, okay? When you say that, and I think a lot of Americans actually picture this monolithic entity. Well, Asian Americans make up 5% of the US population, and it is actually a made-up category, right? I'm often asked then what countries make up Asia? And I actually say, well, when you think about it, America actually created this concept of Asia. Why is that? Because we have actually taken a bunch of different countries and distinct cultures. They all speak different languages, cannot communicate with each other, right? And then group them together as one. To make it even more complicated, what we've done is we've taken countries that have a history of wanting to conquer, to kill, to just do awful, awful things to each other, and basically said, over here, you're the same, right? So imagine calling a Bills fan a Cowboys fan and how they would react. Then take that to a whole different level, right? And you can kind of see the indignity then of being a Korean American person being called Japanese American when there is a long history of Japan's brutality against Korea. It gets even more confusing because I'm Taiwanese American, as was mentioned in the information in my little short bio. And what does that mean? It means I'm ethnic Chinese, but also because China tried to invade Taiwan, I grew up being taught to hate the Chinese government also. So it does get very, very complicated. And there's indignity of being grouped together with your mortal enemy, right? There is actually no sense of Asia. That is, people in Asia don't feel commonalities to each culture, right? This idea of Asia then comes outside of these Asian countries. And what generally happens, even though you're looking at a wide range of multiple ethnicities that have kind of immigrated in different waves, mainstream America reduces all of Asian Americans into the largest ethnic group that has historically been here the longest, which are the Chinese Americans, okay? And so this Asian American hate is being framed as a very recent issue, but we can actually go all the way back to the 1800s to look then at how all this started. So in the 1800s, the railroads actually needed workers to build the railroads. They put out ads for a while, and actually very few white people signed up to do these jobs. So what happened, America actually recruited labor from China. Only men were allowed to immigrate because they were the ones who were working. So their wives and children weren't allowed to immigrate. And it was backbreaking labor. It was horrible labor that people didn't want to do. And also because they were kind of hungry and needed the work, these Chinese laborers were willing to live in conditions that most white Americans would not live in at the time. They essentially connected the east side of America to the west side of America. And then right then were turned around and then scapegoated for stealing jobs from white people. Okay. So this idea of scapegoating, you're just taking a small group with very little power and then blaming them for the social problems of an entire society. The Chinese were an easy target, right? That is, our differentness was stamped onto our faces. What happened? They were invited here to work, but they were denied citizenship and said, you will never be a citizen in the United States. Couldn't purchase land. That any Chinese children that were there were actually segregated and put into separate schools. And then California actually made it illegal to employ Chinese Americans whatsoever. So asked them to come over, please build America's infrastructure, and then say, well, no, we don't want you. At the time then referred to as permanent aliens, and this idea then that they would never fully become Americans. The violence at that time was enormous. That is murders, lynchings. The largest lynching in the United States was in 1871 in Los Angeles, where 17 Chinese American men were hanged. Okay. That it got so bad that China actually became the first country to be banned to immigrate to the United States at all in 1882. So as the Chinese Exclusion Act basically said, no immigration from China and East Asia. And at the time, the President Arthur, who at that time said that the Chinese were an element ignorant of our constitution and law, impossible of assimilation with our people, and dangerous to our peace and welfare. And that's after inviting them to come over to build the country's infrastructure. There was a century then, almost a century of no immigration from East Asia. And it might have actually continued that way, except that in the mid-60s then, America actually faced a huge crisis, and that is a lack of STEM people, STEM specialists, right? So what happened at the time, America did not have enough scientists. They had people in technology, engineering, and math. So then they went and heavily recruited in East Asian countries and said, hey, if you are an engineer, if you're a mathematician, if you're a scientist, then we actually welcome you to come to the United States. What did they do? They went to some of the top universities in East Asia and then skimmed the top graduates of each STEM class and heavily recruited them to come. So the Immigration Act of 1965 opened up immigration from East Asia, but the requirements were pretty stringent. My dad graduated from National Taiwan University, which is kind of the highest level of, it's the highest ranked university in Taiwan. So it'd be like going to MIT or Harvard. His graduating class graduated in 1963. The Immigration Act was in 1965, and my dad immigrated in 1967. Okay. And what happened is that generation of engineers, mathematicians, scientists, they actually worked on America's infrastructure also. This time, not the railroads though, looking at the highways, the bridges, the engineering that needs to go into creating the roads that we drive on. Okay. Now, this is the first wave of immigration from, East Asia in 1965. But even though it was only the first wave and it was a very, very specifically selected group of people, mainstream America have taken a look at that one small part of Asian American immigration and then held that up as kind of the model for all Asian Americans. So what happens is that when you look at our demographics, you'll see that the socioeconomic status of Asian Americans looks relatively high. Now, with no context whatsoever, and you say, oh, well, Asian Americans have high educational levels and high, socioeconomic statuses. Well, they're doing well. This group then must be doing really well. America's not racist. We're not racist at all. See, this group succeeded. What happens when you take the top 1% of competitively educated scientists, right, in the world, then yes, you're going to have a higher education level. In fact, my dad and his friends actually only came to the United States to go to graduate school. So they had gotten accepted to a graduate school in order to be, allowed to immigrate to the country. Without the context of why they were selected and why they were selected to work here, it then actually becomes easy to flatten an entire extremely multifaceted group, okay? And so that's just the first wave, and it is the one that people tend to associate, but we are looking at a whole different diaspora now. And so Dr. Carroll is going to actually talk a little bit about more recent immigration and the groups in Rochester.
Thanks, Natasha. Talking about local diversity, I do want to kind of set up the different Asian and Asian American populations that we do have here in Rochester as a way of laying the foundation for our second and third program of this series, where we're hoping you're going to hear from more local voices. Just an aside though, before I get started, Natasha was talking about the 1965 Immigration Act. And I think what's really interesting is that that bill essentially changes the nature of immigration to the US that was predominantly European to allow a lot more people from different countries, because it changes the quota system that dictated what the national origins were for people who could migrate. And what I think is really fascinating is that there was a provision put into the bill that proponents hoped would help to kind of maintain this pattern of mostly Europeans coming to the US, despite this change to the system, and it backfired on them. And that provision was to provide priority to family members, to allow people who are already in the US to sponsor family members to come to the country. And it kind of backfired on them because they thought that would help to maintain these flows from Europe, but actually interest in migrating to the US declined at that time. And what ended up happening was that a lot of skilled workers from other countries outside of Europe started coming and then pulling their family in. So just an aside about that, I just think it's interesting that, that even as immigration changes and there are proponents who want to keep certain kinds of people in and certain kinds of people out, sometimes there are unintended consequences. And I think family reunification as one of the ways in which we prioritize who comes to this country has been something that's been debated. So I wanted to add that. But yes, I am here to talk about local diversity. And I think that here in Rochester, you might be aware that there were Lao and Vietnamese families that came as refugees in around the 1980s to Rochester, but I'm going to focus on something that I think, at least with my students, they don't often realize, is that we actually have refugees coming into Rochester kind of in the past decade, quite a number. The largest groups have come from Myanmar, also known as Burma, Bhutan, Iraq, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. I refer to these groups as New Americans because refugee is a United Nations designation. It is a legal status, and it implies that on paper, at least, you have human rights that should be acknowledged and protected by an international community. refugees to the United States come with an expectation that they are going to become citizens. Within a year, they will become permanent residents and no longer be referred to as refugees, although they may feel like that was a transformative experience and identify as such. And within 5 years, they will be eligible for citizenship. In the chat that they noted that there are people that are coming from Nepal. And when I say one of the largest groups coming in is from Bhutan, those were descendants of Nepali migrants who then went to Bhutan and then were stripped of citizenship and ended up being displaced in Nepal. So new Americans are under they face unique challenges, and I think they have stresses that are not commonly shared by other groups that migrate to the US. So in addition to the language barrier and cultural differences, and just some of the difficulties in managing a new environment, especially if you've been living in a rural refugee camp and then coming to this urban landscape, trying to figure out the public transportation system, many of the new American families that I know are very much preoccupied with just the day-to-day survival and the basics of paying their bills. And they have to contend with histories of family separation, interrupted education, periods of unemployment where they might have become distilled. And unlike other refugee groups, those particularly from Myanmar and Bhutan have spent decades in refugee camps. I've met individuals who grew up in refugee camps, and that's kind of all that they know, as well as there are groups that have been displaced to cities where essentially they were treated as unauthorized migrants. Many new Americans have lost all their savings and assets while in flight trying to get to a place of refuge, and they arrive impoverished and are placed in housing in poorly resourced areas where they can feel unsafe. And so I haven't heard of any hate crimes due to COVID-19 occurring among the new Americans that I know, but that is not to say that they haven't already have been facing discrimination and harassment. I think new Americans are particularly vulnerable to racism and violence, partly due to their lack of English proficiency. They might be unwilling or less willing to report crimes or not feel as capable of doing so. I think being visibly different, they can be perceived as easy targets. When I think back to, over 10 plus years in which I've had the privilege to volunteer with and work with different new American communities, just looking at the community I'm most aware of, those that come from Myanmar, I have heard of 2 women that told me that when they walk down the street, they feel like people are looking down at them. They've been sworn at. In one case, the woman was called Chinese in a derogatory manner. One family complained that one night after their kids had gone to bed, cops chased somebody literally almost outside of their windows, and it was quite terrifying. I've heard of young men harassing families by knocking on their doors and then nobody's there, and then knocking again, nobody's there. So it's like an intimidation tactic. I've heard of a stabbing at a local church. I met a man who was punched within steps of his front door. I was horrified to find out that previously his wife had been knocked unconscious on the street while trying to buy diapers just a few blocks from her home. And homes have been robbed. In one case, the car tires were slashed of the family car. In another case, children were playing in the front yard and they were also physically assaulted. In both those cases, those families actually ended up moving out of New York State because of concerns over safety. 2 years ago, I spoke to one community leader of the Karenni community, which is an ethnic group from Myanmar. And this community leader told me that in his view, his people are living in constant fear, afraid to step outside of their homes, that they are not the kind of people who would complain. He referred to them as being shy, so they rarely report things to the police, even though he is encouraging them to do so. A college student told me, and it was really affecting to me to hear her say that when she found out she was coming to America, that she would be resettled to the United States, she had all these hopes for her younger siblings. She kind of imagined that they'd be running free, playing outside, that the family would be having barbecues and gathering outdoors. And that turned out not to be the case. There's actually a playground within sight of the apartment where they're living. And she was saying how her younger sister used to look out that window and just like adoringly look at that playground, but she was never allowed to go play on it because the family felt it was not safe. And I just remember listening to this college student tell me that she thought of America as a place of refuge, and she never imagined that she would be that fearful once she moved to America. It was not the refuge that she had imagined. And I think that of all these things that I've heard about happening in our community, what really stands out to me the most and weighs most heavy on my heart is the murder of Jit Mangar in 2015 outside of a convenience store in broad daylight. To me, that's just a tragic reminder of why it is that new Americans feel like they're particularly vulnerable, and just kind of adds to their concerns of public safety living in the city. For Asian new Americans, the potential for discrimination is multi-level. They're visibly foreign, they may be poor, they may be receiving public assistance. And I should mention that the US federal refugee resettlement program itself has a lot of similarities to what is popularly known as the welfare system. And so there's that level of stigma. There's also can be stigma because one is of refugee origins. And so needing or feeling like you have to be grateful, proving grateful for the humanitarian assistance, prove that you're somehow worthy of being taken in, given refuge, and sometimes finding yourselves permanently cast as always helpless and as always dependent, when that certainly is not the case. At many levels, Asian new Americans may feel like they do not belong, and they may feel like it is not in their cultural values to speak out, or as one Nepali college student told me, may not feel safe enough to complain and to assert a voice. And yet these new Americans are essential frontline workers. They are our newest citizens. And I can name so many examples of how Asian new Americans in our community are making our community stronger and better. They are engaged and not just looking out for their own communities, but for broader Rochester society. And I think all of these fears and all of this particular vulnerabilities become harder during the pandemic. The CDC notes that newly resettled refugees may be at greater risk of COVID-19, and that's due to a combination of factors like their living arrangements, work conditions, and lack of integration into society. The issues I hear from those who work with local refugee communities as service providers is that getting information out about COVID and social distancing has been very difficult, that like everybody else, having children at home and dealing with the technology gap and with remote learning are also difficulties that exacerbate all of these pre-existing concerns about safety, about feeling like we can't leave the home, and playing on these pre-existing concerns over not belonging and feeling insecure about your place in American society. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions, and I appreciate all of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll and Dr. Christensen. We have several questions, so I'll just start. Thinking about this past year, calling this global pandemic the China virus, Wuhan virus, or Kung Fu virus reinforces ideas of racism. Can you speak to this? Dr. Carroll, do you want to start?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Christina. So I have heard people say, well, didn't COVID come from China? I don't think I'm being racist by saying that what seems to be a fact. But I think we should be clear that if the first documented case of COVID may have indeed come from Wuhan and come from China. We're still looking for evidence, like the World Health Organization is still looking to discern what the actual origin of the virus is. And so I think it's important to kind of be accurate with our facts. But regardless of the origins of COVID-19, I think it's the implications of how we talk about it and how we go about investigating its origins that I think are really important, because there have been all these racist and discriminatory overtones, right? So rather than blaming a specific government, somehow conflating that all of China is the same as its particular government, or I think associating Chinese Americans or Asian Americans with the Chinese government is a way of denying that they actually belong to the United States. And I think that these kind of stereotypes are not only discriminatory, right, but they kind of lead to these ideas of, well, who does belong to the United States? What do they look like? And that's a path that kind of takes us towards white supremacy that I think that some people may not realize they're treading on that path. And so I'm reminded of a time in 1944 during World War II. The U.S. was not accepting anybody fleeing Nazi persecution for refuge or asylum. And at that time, there were groups in the United States who argued that the nation needs to focus on America, right? There were actually slogans like, we need to focus on American children, not on refugee children. There was actually some nativist groups who were saying it's dangerous to let Nazi-controlled peoples from Europe come to the United States. And this was actually, at the time, there is one exception to the rule of the US not accepting people from fleeing Nazi persecution. And that was in 1944, where a local military based here in upstate New York in Oswego accepted about 982 refugees to Fort Ontario. But I bring this up because there were nativist groups at that time that were saying, oh, these people are from Nazi controlled parts of Europe. They're somehow associated with Nazism, right? There was already this concern for, do they belong here? We have to look out for our own interests. And I see that rhetoric coming out today, right? That somehow Asian Americans are not somehow a part of America, or Asian Americans are more associated to these other groups, China in this case being vilified. And so I do see connections with racism and discrimination. And I think that it's really important to be very conscious of how we talk about these things.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll. This is for you, Dr. Christensen. Can you address the link between racism and this? I'm sorry, that's the wrong question. There's often a narrative about tensions between BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color groups when violence occurs in our communities. Can you address this narrative?
And once again, using the framework of critical race theory, we can actually look at it as the US government has a vested interest in maintaining that America is not racist or not founded on racism. And so a lot of the mainstream narrative, a lot of what gets kind of broadcast to us is how this argument is framed. A lot of attention in the media is played to a Black-Asian conflict. And I'm quite often asked, what about this Black-Asian conflict? And I can say that when you look at it, it has been carefully set up as an adversarial cause when you are actually looking at two groups then who are facing oppression and exploitation from the same source. So essentially what has happened then is taking a group that is associated then with a high level of socioeconomic status and education. And as I already explained, that really has to do with how the laws were created in coming over. And then also taking a group that has been oppressed for 400 years, right? Denied education until the last 50 years, and basically saying, trying to compare them to each other. Now, if you compare these two categories that have way different experiences, right, way different backgrounds, of course, there's going to be resentment. There's going to be this feeling of pitting then different groups against each other. On a very personal note, I was born in 1971, and I was one of the first, of the generation who was born in the United States after that 1965 Immigration Act. And I had no model. I was very alienated as a kid. I didn't understand what was going on around me because I was constantly getting these questions no one else had to answer. Now, if you ask a little kid how she knows how to speak English, how is any kid going to answer how they know how to speak a language? I felt completely like an outsider, and I had no role models except for the civil rights movement. That in the 70s, when I was growing up, I heard Black is beautiful all the time, and basically had the, wonderful privilege and opportunity of being socialized in a very multicultural setting. And what I found is that when you look at BIPOC, we actually have way more commonalities with each other than against each other. And we need to really reject this narrative that we are fighting against each other, because it is only through working together that we are going to make any progress. I told you, Asian Americans are 5%. Black Americans are 12%. Latinx then kind of edging up to 18%. Alone then, you're not looking at a giant movement. Together, and then also with the white people who are joining us today, it's going to be an issue of everyone coming together rather than seeing each group as a separate entity.
Okay, I have a few follow-up questions, perhaps to this one. You mentioned that Asian people are living in the city. Have there been any helpful connections with Black communities? If not, how can we make that connection? As a Black person, I was disturbed to see some Black people taking part in hurting vulnerable Asian people across the country. And following that, there is also another question to talk about that intersection between Asian American and Black American experiences with white violence. So I don't know if you both want to answer that, or Dr. Christensen, do you want to start?
Dr. Carroll, do you want to do this one, since you work most closely with, I mean, that's your work. So I would actually like for you to take this one.
Sure, I think, it can be really difficult. So I often work out of different nonprofit groups and outreach centers or libraries in the different communities and neighborhoods. And it can be hard because I think there is a perception that refugees are, that new American groups are getting resources that others in the same community are lacking. And so, and that can create some tension and resentment and kind of misinformation as to whose needs are being recognized. I think it can be in terms of people who are looking to donate and to provide charitable contributions. The newer, more recent, visibly foreign group might get more attention because they do fulfill this idea of kind of being like a worthy victim, or there are these associations. So I think that the ways of working around that are all these wonderful anti-poverty measures and programs that are being kind of advocated and discussed and initiated. I think that could be a rising tide for everybody in these neighborhoods, and I work mostly in the Northwest quadrant. And I think also, I'll leave it at that for now.
I also want to interject in there. In Monroe County, Asian American population is 2%, and we are very scattered. As Dr. Carroll and I've explained, it's not a unified group. So when we talk about organizing, we are talking about fairly small numbers kind of scattered in different communities. So I just wanted to interject with that.
Okay, and again, related to our discussion here, what coalitions to challenge white supremacy have been formed among Asian groups and other immigrant groups such as Hispanics or those from the Caribbean, as well as with the Black community. I don't know if you want to address that specifically. I don't know here in Rochester if this question is for nationally.
So, so the question is specifically about Rochester, or is it about?
No, it doesn't. I'm just,
nationwide?
yeah, I'm just asking if you have any information about that locally.
So,
yeah.
So sorry. Oh, go ahead. Do you have information? Because I actually wanted to say, like,
Okay.
because the Asian American population now does consist of many new Americans and new immigrants. Immigrants generally do not have the time and the resources and the energy to engage in activism in the way that, you know, an American who has been here and has been settled. So you see a lot of the activism then happening among my generation, the, you know, people who were actually born in the United States and raised in the United States, and the organizing then actually does fall on a lot of times along the lines of working with the anti-racist organizations that have been actually set up by Black Americans. And so it is very much kind of coalition building just through our smaller numbers, that joining larger numbers too.
I'd like to ask this question actually in light of what happened in Atlanta and actually this year around this country. Could you speak to the cultural significance of some of the most vulnerable community members, elders, massage workers within Asian American communities being the targets of racist violence? Why them, and what effect does that have upon the community around these people being attacked?
This is a tough one. It really is. I think it's tough for all three of us to deal with this one. But it does really talk about the level of dehumanization that's going on. Really, the level of dehumanization, because when you see elderly people, most people feel compassion. Most people feel protection. And again, it's the trope that a Boy Scout will help an elderly lady walk across the street. Just the fact that elderly Asians in their 80s and their 90s are being targeted just kind of speaks to how horrific and how we aren't being considered as human, right? Because you're looking at kind of the weakest, most vulnerable people, and they're the ones being attacked. You know, come at me, come at me. Don't come at a 90-year-old, come at me. It's incredibly, I mean, it's incredibly angering. Like, I've been livid for I don't know how long, right? And it is the act of a coward. It is truly the act of a coward to sucker punch a senior citizen. It really is.
All right, I'm gonna move to another question. How can we best support our community members from Myanmar who are dealing with this civil unrest in their home country right now? Dr. Carroll.
There are others in the community who can speak to this much better. We have a number of service providers who the majority of their clients are from Myanmar. Within these new American populations, we have a lot of mutual associations that are starting to form, and I think they might have Facebook pages. I think. Are you asking about like supporting advocacy from the U.S. like to the government on the behalf of those in Myanmar, or really directly helping those who are being forcibly displaced and persecuted in Myanmar right now? I think there's two different levels, right? On the larger level are you could go through the United Nations or an international organization if you wanted to provide advocacy, Human Rights Watch on that level. And then at the local level, there are different groups here who, that are then started by new Americans who are also advocating the federal government on behalf of their communities back in Myanmar. And I can try to get you a list and put it in the resources, but hopefully maybe in some of the upcoming sessions, we might also have that come to light a little bit more, depending on who our panelists are.
Yeah, somebody did ask about voting rights for Asians. I don't know if they're talking about new Americans. I don't know if either one of you, certainly if you are Asian, Asian American, born in the US, that's a different context than a new American.
Maybe any kind of disenfranchisement measures being taken against particular Asian American communities, which I am not aware of, except that, you know, I think a lot of these disenfranchisement tactics can kind of work for all groups, right? So those with records of incarceration and so forth, and maybe that's what they're kind of getting at.
Let me read a few other questions here. And this might be, you know, thinking about othering in general, but any comments that panelists would like to share about Orientalism from the 19th century? For example, Puccini's opera, Madame Butterfly, Edward Said and David Henry Hwang's critical revision of Madame Butterfly. She is wondering about the panelists' views of Orientalism before the 20th century US involvement in wars in Asian countries. So I don't know if either of you want to speak to the historical perspective.
I'm going to say that we have 7 minutes, and that if I actually started on this one, I would need a lot more than 7 minutes. So
thanks for keeping track of the time. Okay. Well, maybe what we should do then is, here's a comment from Dr. Smith that I'll read. Education is one of many issues we need to address. How can we tell a more complex history of the US? Seems many don't know its robust, diverse, and problematic history, some of which you've laid out. Maybe that's a good place to have some final statements, and then we can wrap up for tonight.
I think that we need to start teaching children. Children have an inherent sense of justice. If you've spent any time around a preschooler, you know the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, that's not fair. They got more. This isn't fair, right? You start introducing the concepts that America is very flawed and needs to be better, and that we need to work to improve at a very young age. You already changed then the outcomes. I have so many students who basically in my sociology of race classes just stop and go, how come I had to come to college to learn all of this? And my response is, how come you had to come to college to learn all of this? So I say we start teaching young. Children actually understand a lot more than we give them credit for. And I think that in order for this to actually really start hitting, then we need to change the curriculum in our schools. That California now, it has actually made it so that ethnic studies is a part of the K through 12 curriculum. This needs to be something implemented nationwide.
Dr. Carroll, did you want to?
I agree about the education angle. And I also want to say that I appreciate all the people that we have joining us today who are open to learning and kind of raising your awareness of local communities. I think it means a lot to me that we can learn about and from each other and support each other as we kind of share our grief during this period of really heightened stress and uncertainty. I think that means a lot. I think for myself personally, I'm on this journey where I think I try to model for my students. It's not easy to talk about racism and discrimination, especially if you are living in families where that might be multiracial, might be multi-ethnic, and there's a lot of differing political views. So much has gotten politicized recently, and it can be hard to have those conversations and to be honest. And so I've been thinking a lot about how do we talk to each other about these things. And I think looking for common ground is part of that. And so I do thank all of you for joining us and trying to find common ground with us tonight.
Thank you to both of you tonight for lending us some, giving us some information to put in historical and contemporary context. Karen and I did plan this series before what happened last week, and I think it highlights the need to have these continued conversations in our schools, our communities, and with our families, and not only when tragedies occur. So thank you both. I think on a personal note, it was wonderful. This is a rare occasion for me to be with a panelist of Asian American women, and I think this week in particular, it impacted me quite profoundly. So thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon. Christina, thank you. I just want to mention, by the way, I think I neglected to introduce myself at the beginning of the program. I'm Karen Elam, director of the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. I just wanted to take a moment in closing to thank the nearly 200 people, 200 of you that joined us today and the more than 400 that registered for this program. Thank you so much to our presenters, Dr. Natasha Chen Christensen and Dr. Pilapa Esara Carroll, for an incredibly rich, informative, and important program. Thank you, Christina Lee, for her invaluable service on our steering committee and also for her expert moderating on today's program. We are grateful to our entire steering committee for their dedication, grateful for the generous support of the William and Mildred Levine Foundation and the guidance of the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. I will ask you to please complete the survey that will pop up at the conclusion of today's program to provide us with the feedback we need to develop responsive and relevant programming. And as a quick aside, I just want to mention, I saw in the chat box, somebody asked, would the Levine Center help organize a forum on these topics and allow us to connect to each other and start having conversations on these issues and concerns to raise awareness and educate people in Greater Rochester? Yes, that's exactly what we're doing with these programs and more, and we will continue to do that. Your feedback will be critical to that. And I will say, just mark your calendars, October 17th, we will have the second of our Summit to End Hate. We had one last fall. We will repeat that again, probably online, unfortunately. We'd love to do it in person, but I think until we can all be safe, that's how we'll do it. So you will have all that information coming to you, along with those of you that registered, a recording from today's program. We will also be putting that on our website. Please be sure to join us for the rest of the series, April 11th and May 2nd. And lastly, but not least, keep an eye out for additional resources from the Levine Center to End Hate that you can use to continue your learning and stand up for our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Thank you all so much. Thank you again to the presenters and the moderator, and have a safe and enjoyable evening.